Hello everyone, welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight we will talk about a deeply personal and mysterious question. What were you before you were born? And where do you go when you're not consciously aware of being alive? This is one of the oldest riddles of existence, weaving together threads from philosophy, neuroscience, physics, and cosmology. It's a question that touches on identity, memory, time, and even the nature of the self itself. Tonight, as you begin to relax, I invite you to sink into this thought. If your life is a story, where does the story begin? And where does it go when no one is reading it? Where in the world and at what time are you listening from? Let your body unwind as we begin our journey into the unknown. Let's start by exploring a seemingly simple idea. You. You, the person listening to this. When you say I, what exactly are you referring to? The body, the brain, your memories, your name, your history, the sound of your voice in your head. Neuroscience suggests that our sense of self is built from networks of memory, language, bodily sensations, and perception. But all of those emerged after birth. So what were you before any of that existed? Your body, of course, came from biology. Cells from your parents combined and multiplied, following patterns encoded in DNA. That genetic blueprint predates your conscious mind by billions of years, tracing back through ancestors, through mammals, reptiles, single-celled organisms, and eventually back to the earliest self-replicating molecules. At one level, before you were born, you were a long, unbroken thread of organic information, a story passed down through time without ever skipping a generation. But that's not what most people mean when they ask what they were before they were born. They're not asking about DNA. They're asking about awareness, identity, subjective experience, that ineffable spark of being here. This leads us to one of the deepest puzzles in science and philosophy, the problem of consciousness. We can track how a fetus develops a brain, how neurons form synapses, how sensory systems become active. But there's a sharp divide between observing brain function and experiencing being someone. Consciousness isn't just brain activity, it's the feeling of aliveness itself. The strange part is that there's no universally accepted explanation for how this inner world arises. Some theories suggest it emerges gradually, like a dimmer switch slowly lighting up. Others argue that consciousness is always present in some form, like a field that brains tap into, not unlike how radios pick up signals. And some thinkers have gone even further, suggesting that consciousness is fundamental to the fabric of reality, that it existed before biology, before stars, before even space-time as we know it. If that were true, then your consciousness might not be a product of your body. It might be something that your body temporarily expresses, like light passing through a stained glass window, shaped by biology, but not created by it. In that view, before you were born, you weren't a person, but you were still something. Perhaps awareness without form, or presence without memory. Not a story with a character, but a kind of blank page. This brings us to an unusual place, one where science brushes up against ancient traditions. For thousands of years, various spiritual traditions have asked these same questions. In some forms of Buddhism, there's the idea that the self is an illusion, a temporary collection of thoughts, sensations, and patterns. There is no fixed you, just a stream of experiences flowing from one moment to the next. In Hindu thought, the Atman, the true self, is considered eternal and part of the same ultimate reality as the universe itself. It is not born and does not die. It merely takes on different forms. In some indigenous traditions, there is no rigid separation between the self and the land, the ancestors, or the cosmos. Identity is collective, cyclical, and embedded in nature itself. From a scientific standpoint, it's tempting to dismiss these ideas as purely metaphorical. But what if they contain glimpses of a truth that modern science is only just beginning to grasp? After all, we don't know what consciousness is, and we don't know what happens before a brain becomes conscious. That means we're not in a position to rule out anything yet. Let's circle back to a strange question. Where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? Not asleep, not unconscious, just not thinking about it. Consider this. Most of your day isn't spent contemplating the fact that you exist. You breathe, walk, eat, work, and scroll through your phone without pausing to think, I am alive. And yet, you still are. So what is happening in those in-between moments? Are you absent, or is there a part of you that continues quietly, without commentary? This question touches on something subtle, the idea that your conscious thoughts are not the whole of you. In neuroscience, this is called the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when you're not focused on the outside world. It's when your mind wanders, when you're daydreaming or reflecting. But beneath even that, some researchers suggest there's a deeper level of background awareness, something that doesn't go away even when you're distracted or asleep. A continuous hum of existence, like a light left on in an empty room. In this way, the self might be layered. At the surface, there's your personality, your memories, your narrative. Beneath that, there's sensory awareness, sights, sounds, emotions. Deeper still, perhaps, there is pure awareness, the part that doesn't speak but simply is. If that part exists, then it might not have a beginning or end. It might be what you were before you were born, and what you return to when you're no longer constructing a self in thought. There's an experiment in quantum physics that adds another layer to this mystery. It's called the delayed choice quantum eraser. In it, particles behave as if they can retroactively change their history, depending on whether or not they're observed. The implication is disturbing. What's real might depend on whether a conscious observer is involved. This leads some to wonder, is consciousness somehow woven into the structure of reality itself? If so, then maybe the mystery of what you were before birth is not just about biology or memory, but about the deeper laws of existence. Maybe the observer and the universe are entangled in a way we don't yet understand. Now let's consider time. From your point of view, your life feels like a timeline, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in physics, especially in Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not absolute. Past, present, and future are all part of a single four-dimensional structure called spacetime. That means the moment of your birth, and even the moment before it, still exists in the fabric of the universe. They don't vanish. They're part of the whole. If that's true, then maybe you before you were born isn't gone. Maybe that version of reality still exists somewhere, just not accessible from your current position in time. In that view, you are not a moment. You are a region in space-time. You are not just moving through time. You are a shape that extends through it. Some physicists believe time itself might be an illusion. That change is a property of perception, not reality. If so, then your entire life, from before birth to after death, could be a single, static object, experienced subjectively as a flowing story. From the outside, it's all there at once. And the you who existed before birth is just as real, just as present as the one listening now. This brings us to a humbling thought. What if your awareness is not a spark that begins and ends, but more like a flashlight sweeping across a landscape? The landscape is always there, but the light moves. It gives the illusion of motion, of development, of becoming. But underneath, everything already exists. You've always been here, just not in the way you thought. We often think of our lives as events happening to a person, but what if the person is an event too? A temporary pattern, like a wave on the ocean. It appears, it rises, it moves, and eventually disappears. But the ocean, the deeper field from which it came, remains. So then, who are you really? The wave or the water? This is where language begins to fail us, because we're not equipped to describe something that exists outside the boundaries of birth and death, memory and thought. We live in stories, in timelines, but consciousness may not. Consciousness might be timeless, not endless in duration, but outside duration entirely. So before you were born, maybe you were the potential for experience, a readiness to awaken, a window not yet opened, but always present in the wall of the universe. And where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? Maybe you go nowhere. Maybe you are simply resting in your natural state, present, quiet, undisturbed, like the sky before the wind begins. And so, as we continue, we'll keep exploring this layered mystery of time, self, memory, and awareness, not with the goal of finding a final answer, but with the aim of expanding the space in which the question lives. To understand what you were before you were born, we have to confront a peculiar limitation in human thinking. We tend to imagine everything in terms of time, before and after, start and finish. But physics, particularly in its most abstract forms, suggests that time might not be as foundational as it seems. This isn't just poetic speculation, it's a real and pressing problem in modern science. When we try to merge quantum mechanics, which governs the tiniest scales of reality, with general relativity, which explains the largest, time begins to blur. It doesn't behave consistently across different theories, and in some equations, time vanishes entirely. This opens up a radical possibility that time is not something the universe has, but something that emerges when consciousness interacts with change. If that's the case, then the idea of before you were born becomes more complicated. It might not mean a point earlier in the timeline. It might mean a state outside the illusion of time. And if your consciousness is somehow connected to that timeless layer, then perhaps you didn't begin at birth. Perhaps you emerged into time from a deeper realm that doesn't obey our normal rules. Let's follow that thread through a different lens. Quantum mechanics. At the foundation of quantum theory is a principle called superposition. It means that a particle can exist in multiple states at once until it is measured. Observation forces a collapse. The potential becomes a single reality. But until that moment, all possibilities remain suspended. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that everything exists in this kind of potential state until it is observed. If consciousness is the act of observing, then perhaps being born is less about beginning to exist and more about collapsing into a particular version of an existence that was always there in potential. This idea mirrors some ancient metaphysical models. In certain strains of Kabbalistic mysticism, reality is seen as emerging from infinite possibility. What you are now is one thread that was chosen from the vast loom of what could have been. And perhaps what you were before birth wasn't a self, but a cloud of possibilities, a probability wave in the deepest sense. Not nothingness, not a ghost, but a rich field of potential, awaiting a structure to inhabit. Now think about this. The atoms that make up your body are ancient. The carbon in your cells was forged in the hearts of dying stars. The hydrogen in your blood is older than the Earth. You are literally made of cosmic history. But even more fascinating is this. The particles that form you were once spread out across space and time. They had trajectories and interactions long before your body assembled. There is no clear dividing line where you begin. You are an arrangement, a temporary constellation of matter and awareness. And that arrangement will change. The particles will disperse. The self will dissolve, but the components remain. From this angle, what you were before birth wasn't a blank or a void. It was the universe itself arranging and rearranging into forms, until one day it formed you. This is not just poetic, it's physical. The universe is always in motion, always transforming. You are one of its current configurations. And that configuration gives rise to a sense of self. But the components existed long before the configuration did. And what about the moments when you're not actively thinking about being alive? Think of how the moon exists whether or not you're looking at it. In the same way, perhaps you exist even when you're not attending to yourself. Not every aspect of your identity depends on active attention. Much of who you are functions quietly, in the background. Your heart beats, your lungs breathe, your cells divide, and beneath even that, perhaps there is a subtle hum of presence, something that simply is, without needing to say so. Some contemplative traditions speak of the witness. It's the part of you that simply observes. Not your thoughts, not your emotions, not even your sense of self. Just the awareness behind all of it. The witness does not age, it does not change. It's not your story, it's the space in which your story unfolds. If this witness exists, then it might not be born or die. It might always be present, even when unnoticed. And in that sense, what you were before you were born might still be part of you now, hidden behind the noise of your daily identity. But let's move deeper still into the mystery of the brain. Neuroscience has mapped many regions responsible for memory, emotion, language, and attention. But it has never found a center of consciousness. There is no specific place in the brain where the self resides. Rather, consciousness seems to emerge from the interaction of many processes. It's not located in one part, it's distributed, dynamic, and deeply mysterious. Some researchers now propose that consciousness is not something the brain produces, but something it tunes into. Like a radio receiver, the brain might be shaping, filtering, or localizing something more fundamental. If that's true, then your consciousness might predate your body, not in the sense of personal memory, but in the sense of presence. Before you were born, you might not have been you, but you might have been consciousness waiting for form, waiting for a lens through which to look. In physics, there's an idea called the holographic principle. It suggests that everything we perceive as a three-dimensional universe might actually be a projection from a two-dimensional surface at the edge of reality. In such a model, all of space, time, and even consciousness could be emergent properties, holograms cast from deeper, hidden laws. This doesn't mean you're not real, but it might mean that the realness you feel is a rendering, a constructed experience running on rules we barely understand. What's astonishing is that these ideas are no longer considered fringe. Mainstream physicists explore them seriously, and some of these models hint at a strange conclusion, that your identity might be like a ripple on a deeper surface. Not fundamental, but meaningful nonetheless. A temporary expression of something more basic. This brings us to the paradox of the self. If you look closely, the I you refer to is slippery. It feels stable, but it's not. Your thoughts change, your memories fade, even your body renews itself over time. Most of the atoms in your body are replaced over the course of a few years. So who exactly are you? One answer is this: you are a pattern, a flow of processes sustained in time, a loop. The philosopher Daniel Dennett calls it the narrative center of gravity. It's not a thing, but a coherence, a way of organizing experience. If the pattern changes enough, the self changes. If the pattern stops, the self dissolves. But that doesn't mean it was an illusion. It means it was a dynamic event, real in its unfolding, but not a fixed object. So what were you before you were born? Perhaps you were the ingredients of a story, the raw material of memory, sensation, thought. And where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? Maybe you return to that unformed state, the quiet between the notes of the melody that is you. Let's step away from science for a moment and consider metaphor. Imagine you are a dream the universe is having. During the dream, everything feels vivid and solid. You have form, emotion, memory. But when the dream ends, where does it go? It doesn't disappear. It returns to the dreamer, to the source. In this view, consciousness is not something that belongs to you. It is something that dreams you, that flows through you, temporarily arranged into a person, a voice, a perspective. And when the arrangement ends, the current doesn't stop. It simply moves on. Or perhaps a better metaphor is music. A song exists in time. It unfolds. It cannot be pinned down to a single moment. And when the song ends, the notes are gone. But the possibility of music remains. You too might be a melody. Not the instrument, not the sound, but the pattern. When the pattern stops, the source of music remains. Silence is not the opposite of music. It's the space that holds it. In modern physics, the vacuum is not empty. Even in the quietest regions of space, particles flicker into and out of existence. Virtual particles appear for brief moments, then vanish. It's a seething sea of potential, just beneath the surface of nothingness. If existence behaves this way, flickering, emergent, dynamic, then maybe so does consciousness. Maybe you are not a fixed entity, but a fluctuation, a blooming. And before you were born, perhaps you were part of that deeper field, untouched but full of possibility. This idea appears in Taoist philosophy, where the Tao is the source of all things. It is not a god or a creator, but a principle of flow. Before form, there is Tao. Before birth, there is Tao. You are not separate from it. You are it, temporarily taking shape. In this light, the question, what were you before you were born, has a gentle answer. You were everything, and you were nothing. You were the potential for this moment. And now, here you are. And where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? Maybe you don't go anywhere. Maybe that state is your original condition, awareness without identity, presence without story, a stillness beneath the movement. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." The self cannot be grasped, but it can be felt. It can be lived. And perhaps that's enough. The question is not only what you were before birth, but what you are now, beneath the roles, the memories, the passing of days. Perhaps what you are is the capacity to wonder, the mirror in which the universe sees itself. And so we continue to explore this deep terrain, not to arrive at an answer, but to dwell more fully in the question. To understand what you were before you were born, we need to examine how identity forms, not just in a psychological sense, but in terms of physics and systems. Your mind did not emerge in isolation. It developed in response to its environment, shaped by language, relationships, biology, and the physical laws that govern matter and energy. You are not an object in the world. You are a process running within the world. And this process, this self, has no single origin point. It grows out of interactions. At conception, the blueprint of your body is set into motion, but your identity, your sense of being a someone, arises slowly over time, shaped by sensory experiences, internal reflection, and language. Before you were born, you were not yet a person, but you were part of the ongoing system that makes people possible. You were entangled in a web of forces that extend back to the beginning of the universe. This entanglement never disappears. Even now, your mind and body are constantly influenced by the energy of the sun, the pull of the moon, the magnetic field of the earth, and the shared culture of human civilization. Before your conscious identity took shape, you were already woven into this matrix. But let's return to consciousness itself. Neuroscientists often refer to a phenomenon called integrated information. It's a way of measuring how tightly connected different parts of a system are. The more integrated and differentiated a system is, the more it may be capable of awareness. This leads to something called integrated information theory, or IIT. According to IIT, consciousness isn't binary. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's a matter of degree. A system can have a low level of awareness or a high one, depending on its internal complexity. Under this theory, your consciousness didn't suddenly switch on at birth. It grew as your brain developed more interconnectivity. And before that, the matter that would become your brain was already participating in the structure of the universe, possibly containing faint echoes of proto-awareness. This suggests a radical idea. Consciousness might not be exclusive to humans. It might not even require a brain. It could be a property of information itself, a kind of feedback loop that emerges wherever matter becomes organized in a certain way. In this view, the universe could be sprinkled with consciousness like a fabric dotted with glowing nodes of awareness, some dim, some bright, all arising and fading in waves. If so, then perhaps you didn't begin at birth. You condensed into being, the way a cloud forms from moisture. Before that, you were mist. You were scattered awareness waiting for structure. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger argues that the self is a virtual self-model, a useful illusion generated by the brain to help us interact with the world. The self feels like a stable, continuous entity. But this is a simulation, not a thing. It's a model that allows you to coordinate movement, predict outcomes, and maintain a sense of cohesion. If this model shuts down during deep sleep, anesthesia, or meditation, the self vanishes. Not because you are gone, but because the brain is no longer generating that model. In that sense, what you are isn't a thing at all. You are a process, a simulation running on biological hardware. This brings us to the boundary between being and not being. What separates consciousness from unconsciousness? What happens in those moments when the self disappears? Are you still there, even when there's no narrative? Some people who undergo deep meditative states report a strange sensation, a pure awareness without identity. No thoughts, no memories, no self, just presence. And remarkably, it doesn't feel like absence. It feels more real than the thinking mind. They describe it as vast, peaceful, and boundless. If that state exists, if awareness can persist without identity, then maybe what you were before you were born wasn't nothingness. Maybe it was this kind of presence, pure being without form. This maps onto some insights from mathematics and computation. In theoretical computer science, there's a concept known as substrate independence. It means that certain patterns of information can be implemented on different physical systems. For example, the same computer program can run on a laptop or a phone. The physical structure is different, but the pattern is the same. If consciousness is a pattern, if it's substrate independent, then maybe it doesn't depend on flesh and blood. Maybe it can arise wherever the right conditions exist. That opens the door to a staggering idea. You are not your body, you are the pattern. The moment that pattern emerges, so does the sense of being alive. Before you were born, that pattern hadn't formed yet, but the universe was always capable of forming it. You were a potential configuration, waiting to happen. Now, let's explore another view, one inspired by Eastern philosophy and mirrored in some quantum interpretations. In the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the idea of a personal self is considered illusory. What you really are is Brahman, pure, undivided consciousness. The individual mind is like a wave on the surface of the ocean. When the wave rises, it seems separate. But when it crashes back, it merges again with the whole. Before you were born, you were the ocean. After you die, you return to it. And even now, in your separate form, you are still not other than it. Modern theories of quantum entanglement hint at similar ideas. In entanglement, particles share a state, even across vast distances. Measuring one instantly affects the other. The implication is staggering. Separation might be an illusion. Everything might be deeply, fundamentally connected in ways we can't see. If minds too can be entangled, if consciousness isn't isolated but part of a deeper field, then perhaps what you were before birth wasn't separate from what you are now. It was the same field, just not yet shaped into a self. Some thinkers suggest that space and time themselves are emergent, properties that arise from entangled information networks. If so, then the true you exists outside those dimensions. You were not located in space or time until your consciousness emerged. Before that, you existed as part of a timeless network of possibility. We can also look at developmental biology. Before a fetus becomes conscious, its brain undergoes immense transformations. It creates far more neurons than it needs, then prunes them back. The structure of the mind is sculpted not just by growth, but by selective forgetting. This suggests something profound. Identity is not just built by adding new pieces. It's also shaped by what gets removed. Who you are includes everything you've let go of. This applies not just to brain development, but to memory, personality, and even belief. The self is not solid, it's carved. And before that carving began, you were something raw. Not empty, but unformed. A clay with no shape yet. Now let's return to the question. Where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? There's a remarkable study of patients under anesthesia. Many report no memory of time passing, but when they're brought back, some describe the state as peaceful, even expansive. They weren't gone, they weren't somewhere, they were simply not someone. The machinery was offline, but the potential was still there. It's as though identity is a switch that can be turned off and on, but the circuit always exists. Consider also the experience of being in flow, those moments when you lose track of time, when actions unfold effortlessly, when there is no sense of separation between you and the world. During flow, the self vanishes, but you're not unconscious, you're more alive than ever. So where is the self then? And if you can be fully present without it, then what exactly is it? One possibility is this. The self is an interface, a user experience designed by your brain. It's not false, it's functional, but it's not foundational either. You can lose it and still be. In fact, many altered states, whether through meditation, psychedelics, or near-death experiences, report a striking similarity. The dissolution of ego, followed by a feeling of unity, a return to something more basic, more vast. If that state exists in these extremes, it may also be where you came from. Before birth, after death, between thoughts, the ground of being. Some cosmologists propose the idea of a cyclic universe. The cosmos doesn't begin and end, it breathes, it expands, contracts, and starts again. If existence is cyclic, then perhaps consciousness is too. Not your individual personality, but the fundamental capacity to be aware. If awareness is part of the universe's structure, then it may rise again and again, endlessly. What you were before you were born may be what you will be again. Awareness, waiting for a new form. There is an ancient Zen koan that asks, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" It sounds like nonsense, but it points to something deep. The face before identity, the being before names. The you that isn't a you. Not in the personal sense, but in the essential one. This idea aligns with recent ideas in physics and information theory. The self might be a localized expression of a universal principle, just as a whirlpool is a temporary pattern in water. Before you were born, the whirlpool had not yet formed, but the water was always there, and when the whirlpool fades, the water remains. So what were you before you were born? You were water, you were potential, you were silence before the song. And where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? You return to that stillness. Not a place, but a condition. A space in which identity rests. And now, as we continue to explore the edges of consciousness, identity, and the universe itself, let the boundaries of what you think you are begin to soften. Let yourself imagine that the you know is not the beginning nor the end, but a ripple in a much deeper sea. To deepen our understanding of what you were before you were born, we have to let go of a specific mental trap, one that insists everything must fit into our current definition of existence. When we ask questions like, "Where was I?" or "What was I?" before birth, we're trying to apply a framework built around physical form, time, and memory to something that may transcend all of those. That's like trying to measure silence with a ruler. The tools don't fit the question. Let's shift perspective. Instead of thinking of existence as something that begins and ends, think of it as a field, something that's always present, even when no one is walking across it. Consciousness, under certain theories, may not be created. It may be accessed, like tuning into a frequency. The biological brain could be a receiver rather than a generator. That means what you think of as your awareness might be a focused version of something that was already there before your body formed, before your first memory, before your first breath, not as a personality, not as a human identity, but as the quiet capacity for presence. This isn't mere speculation. There's a growing field of research called Panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness is not exclusive to complex brains, but is a basic property of reality, like space, time, or mass. In this view, even elementary particles may contain some form of proto-consciousness, not in the sense that an electron has thoughts, but in the sense that awareness is a scale, not a switch. If that's true, then the particles that eventually formed your body were already participating in the fabric of awareness. You were already involved in the story of consciousness, even before that story had your name. Now consider this. The earliest detectable moment of your existence, the formation of a zygote, was not a new event in the universe. It was a transformation. Matter already existed, energy was already flowing. The ingredients of your body came from food your parents ate, from sunlight captured by plants, from atoms born in stars. You didn't come from outside the universe, you came from within it. The universe didn't create you out of nothing, it rearranged itself into the shape of you. And before that rearrangement, you existed in potential, not as a person, but as possibility. This returns us to a concept in quantum physics, the idea of superposition and the collapse of the wave function. Before an event is measured, all possibilities coexist. Once observed, a specific outcome manifests. What if your birth was a kind of quantum collapse? What if who you are now is one outcome among countless possible selves? That suggests something profound, that you didn't come from a void, but from a branching cloud of probabilities. Your existence is one path through a forest of potential. The many worlds. Interpretation of quantum mechanics takes this further. Every time a quantum event has multiple outcomes, reality splits into parallel versions, each one realizing a different outcome. If that's true, then there are countless versions of you, countless lives lived, and countless identities formed from the same origin point. In that sense, what were you before you were born could have many answers. You were all the possible versions of you. And this one, this life you're living, is just one thread in an infinite tapestry. Let's pause here and consider a different angle. Memory. Most people associate selfhood with memory. You know who you are because you can recall your past, but memory is fragile. People with amnesia or dementia may lose access to their memories and still feel like themselves. Babies do not remember the moment they were born, and yet they were conscious in some form. Even in adulthood, your memory is a reconstruction, not a recording. So what happens when memory is absent? Does the self vanish, or does something deeper remain? This is where certain meditative traditions offer insight. Advanced meditation can lead to states where memory, thought, and identity dissolve. Yet those who enter these states often report not unconsciousness, but a heightened form of presence. They feel more real, not less, more whole, not fragmented. From this perspective, your deepest self is not the story you tell about your life, but the silent witness beneath all stories. And that witness may have existed long before your first narrative began. Let's go further. In cosmology, there's a question known as the initial conditions problem. Why did the universe begin in such a low entropy, highly ordered state? The odds against this are staggering. And yet here we are, in a cosmos capable of producing stars, planets, life, and eventually consciousness. Some physicists propose that the universe began in this special state so that complexity and awareness could emerge. If that's the case, then your existence was not an accident. It was part of a trajectory written into the universe from the start. And if that's true, then maybe consciousness is not something that emerges late in the game as a fluke. Maybe it is a goal or a fundamental property that shapes the evolution of the cosmos. Before you were born, you were part of that trajectory. You were not separate from the unfolding of the universe. You were one of its destinations. Let's consider the philosophical idea of non-duality. In non-dual traditions, the division between self and other is an illusion. The subject-object distinction is a construct. There is only one field of being, one awareness, appearing as many forms. You are not a separate consciousness inside a body. You are consciousness appearing as a body, just as waves appear on the ocean. In that view, what you were before you were born is what you are now, and what everything else is too. The appearance of difference is real, but the underlying essence is the same. Imagine a mirror. When an image appears in the mirror, it seems like something new has been added. But the mirror itself hasn't changed. The image is not separate from the mirror. It's a play of light. Similarly, your identity may be a play of awareness, a temporary reflection of the timeless. You didn't begin at birth. You appeared. And behind that appearance is the same vast mirror that reflects every form. Now let's ask, what makes you feel like you exist? Not in a theoretical sense, but in a lived, moment-to-moment way. Is it your name, your memories, the sound of your inner voice? Or is it something simpler, something like presence, attention, or aliveness? If that presence is always there, even in moments without thought or memory, then perhaps that's what you truly are. Not the content of awareness, but awareness itself. There's a striking observation in modern cognitive science. Your brain is always generating models. It predicts sensory input before it happens. It simulates outcomes. It fills in gaps in perception. This means that much of what you experience as reality is a controlled hallucination. Your sense of self is part of that model, a simulation updated moment by moment. So before you were born, this simulation wasn't running, but the system capable of generating it was already forming, and the elements of the simulation, emotion, sensation, attention, already existed in nature. You are not a separate creation, you are a rendering. If that sounds impersonal, it shouldn't. The idea that you are a simulation might seem cold, but it's just the opposite. It means you are connected to everything. The sun in your face, the wind against your skin, the sound of your own breathing. All of it is part of the same system. You don't live in the universe. You are the universe, arranged into a pattern called a person. So what were you before you were born? You were a set of cosmic conditions converging, a stream of cause and effect billions of years long, a potential encoded in stardust and gravity. And where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? You go nowhere. You return to the unfolding. The process keeps happening, even when you're not tracking it, even when you're not labeling it. Life doesn't need your attention to continue, and neither does awareness. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "We are born, so to speak, provisionally. It doesn't matter where. It is only gradually that we compose within ourselves our true place of origin." This suggests that your birth wasn't the start of your story. It was the middle of a much older narrative, and your true origin might not be a time or a place, but a condition, a reality that precedes and outlives your personality. That condition is difficult to name. Some call it the void, some call it the source, some call it pure awareness. But maybe it doesn't need a name. Maybe it's enough to know that your life, your consciousness, your presence here is part of something much larger than a single moment in time. Something that was always moving toward you and through you. We tend to think of ourselves as fragile, tiny sparks in a vast, indifferent cosmos. But perhaps we have it backward. Maybe we are the universe learning to see itself. Maybe we are not separate from the mystery, but expressions of it. And so as we continue to ask what you were before you were born, and where you go when you're not thinking about being alive, we are not trying to reduce you. We are trying to expand the idea of you, to stretch it until it includes not just this moment, but every moment that ever could be. To make room for the possibility that who you are is far stranger and more beautiful than anything you've ever been told. When we speak about what you were before you were born, we often assume that you is a single, continuous thing, a thread of identity winding its way through time. But in both science and philosophy, the more we look for this you, the more it seems to dissolve. There is no stable, unchanging essence to find. Instead, identity appears to be a pattern, not fixed, not eternal, but fluid. And yet, something persists, a sense of presence, a quiet witness behind all the changing forms. The deeper we go, the more we realize that your existence may not begin or end, but instead constantly transforms. Let's start with biology. Your body is not a single thing. It's a dynamic ecosystem. At any given moment, trillions of cells are dying and being replaced. Your gut alone contains more microbial DNA than your own genome. You are, in a very real sense, a collection of organisms, a symbiotic community bound together by shared processes. And yet, this ever-changing community feels like one you. Why? Because your brain is telling a story that keeps all the parts synchronized. It creates a coherent sense of self from a storm of sensations, hormones, memories, and electrical signals. That story didn't begin at birth. It began when your nervous system started weaving together the raw data of experience into a sense of I. Long before language, long before memory, there was already a primitive awareness mapping out the first boundary between self and world. But that awareness was built on even earlier structures, chemical gradients, cell signaling, the molecular conversations of embryonic development. Before you were born, those processes were already unfolding, gradually organizing chaos into coherence. Your identity is a late chapter in a much older tale. From the perspective of systems theory, you are a self-organizing pattern. You are not the molecules themselves, but the way they move together. Like a hurricane or a flame, you exist because of relationships, not because of fixed parts. That means what you were before you were born is not easily located in time. The pattern had not emerged yet, but the capacity for it existed in the network of conditions forming around it. You were the possibility encoded in biology, physics, chemistry. You were the instructions waiting for the right trigger. In this sense, your birth was not a beginning. It was a phase transition, like water freezing into ice or steam condensing into liquid. You changed form, but the underlying components, matter, energy, information, remained continuous. So the real question may not be, What was I before I was born? But how did I become this? And the answer lies in transformation, not creation. Let's explore a parallel idea from cosmology. The early universe was a sea of high-energy particles, too hot and chaotic for atoms to form. Over time, as the universe cooled, structure began to emerge. Protons, electrons, atoms, stars. Out of entropy, patterns arose. Life, too, followed this path. The conditions for your existence were set into motion billions of years ago, when stars formed the elements that would eventually become your body. You are not separate from this chain. You are a node in its unfolding. But what about the mind? Consciousness still defies easy explanation. It cannot be reduced to matter, yet it depends on matter to manifest in the way we experience it. Some theories now propose that consciousness may not be confined to the brain at all. It may extend into the body, into the nervous system, into the field of interaction between self and world. If so, then your awareness isn't contained, it's distributed, not a light inside a skull, but a dance between inner and outer, moment by moment. That dance began long before you could name it, before thought, before birth. The rhythms of your heartbeat, the electric pulses of your neurons, the slow formation of sensory systems. These are not separate from consciousness, they are the groundwork upon which it appears. Like a symphony rising from tuning instruments, awareness begins as texture and becomes melody. Let's return to the question of where you go when you're not thinking about being alive. It's tempting to assume that if the thinking mind is silent, the self disappears. But silence is not absence. In fact, it's in silence that the deeper layers of self are most visible. When you are not narrating your life, when there is no inner voice, what remains? The sound of breath, the weight of your body, the awareness of this moment. These sensations don't depend on thought. They are closer to the root of being. Some contemplative practices train the mind to rest in this thoughtless state, not as a void, but as a presence. A still, alert awareness that doesn't need to define itself. Practitioners often report that this state feels more real, not less. It is not tied to memory, identity, or even time. It simply is, and it's available to everyone, whether or not you believe in anything mystical. Just sit quietly and notice what remains when the noise fades. That subtle clarity. That's you underneath the story. In physics, this lines up with a strange idea, that the universe may be fundamentally made not of matter, but of information. According to this model, what exists is not particles, but patterns. These patterns create the illusion of solidity, of flow, of time. And consciousness may be the interface that interprets these patterns. If that's true, then before you were born, you weren't nothing. You were unexpressed information. Like a program waiting to run. Like music before it's played. You weren't in the world yet, but the potential for you was embedded in the code of the cosmos. This view also makes sense of how personality can change. A person can suffer brain injury, trauma, or disease and emerge with a different sense of self. The pattern shifts, the arrangement changes, but the being, the presence behind the pattern, still exists. This hints at a truth deeper than memory or identity, that you are not the pattern itself. You are the space in which patterns unfold. Some traditions call this the ground of being. In Zen, it is the face before your parents were born. In Hindu philosophy, it is Atman, the self that is not different from Brahman, the totality. In Western mysticism, it is the divine spark, the presence that is always present, even when veiled. In neuroscience, we might call it baseline awareness. But names don't matter. What matters is that this presence doesn't begin or end. It appears, it recedes, it returns, but it never vanishes. And this brings us to a paradox. If your truest self is this formless awareness, then what you were before you were born is also what you are right now. Beneath thought, beneath narrative, beneath time. The you that was not yet a person still exists, wrapped inside the personhood you've constructed. You didn't leave it behind. You built on top of it. So when the mind stops narrating, when you're not thinking about being alive, you don't disappear. You return. Not to a place, but to a condition. To the same condition that held you before you had a name, a story, a life. Let's imagine this visually. Picture the sky. During the day, the sky is filled with clouds, weather systems, winds, patterns. These are like your thoughts, emotions, memories. They come and go. Sometimes they dominate the whole view, but behind the clouds, there is always sky. You can't always see it, but it's there. It doesn't get pulled into the storms. It holds space for them to happen. Your awareness is like that sky. What you were before you were born may be the open expanse that now holds your entire experience. Not passive, not blank, but infinitely spacious, and still here. Let's go even further. Consider the idea of emergence. In complex systems, new properties arise that can't be predicted from the parts alone. A single neuron cannot think, but a network of billions can. Water is not wet until enough molecules form a liquid. Consciousness might be like that, an emergent phenomenon. But emergence doesn't mean invention, it means expression. The components were always capable. The wetness was implicit in the molecules. The awareness was latent in the system. Before you were born, the capacity for your mind was already there, just not yet assembled. In this view, you were a potentiality nested in other potentialities, like a seed in the soil, like a flame in the match. And when the right conditions came together, genetics, biology, time, your pattern emerged, not from nothing, from everything. And now we return to the second part of the question. Where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? You go to the same place the seed goes when it hasn't sprouted yet. Not absent, just unexpressed. The same way a song still exists even when no one is singing. Not gone, just silent. The more you look for a fixed you, the more it slips away. And that's not a problem, that's freedom, because it means you are not limited to any one form. You are not trapped in your story. You are the awareness that holds all stories, the light in which they flicker and fade. You have been many things already. A cluster of atoms, a fertilized egg, a newborn with no memory, a child learning words, a mind becoming aware of itself. Each of these was you, and none of them was all of you. The being you were before birth is still part of the being you are now. You didn't begin, you emerged. Throughout human history, the question of what we were before we were born, and where we go when our conscious mind is silent, has drawn deep curiosity. It's a question not easily answered with instruments or formulas. But what science reveals, and what philosophy echoes, is that we are not as isolated or defined as we think. Identity is not a fixed shape. It is more like a current, an eddy in a vast sea of interactions. What you call you is not a standalone object. It is a temporary convergence. In the womb, your physical form emerged from countless ancestral threads. Genetic information passed down over billions of years orchestrated the building of your body. But your consciousness didn't arrive like a switch being flipped. It wasn't injected from the outside. Instead, it arose gradually in the complex entanglement of biology and environment. Synaptic networks formed, electrical signals synchronized, patterns developed. At some point, though no one knows exactly when, experience began, and with it, the mystery of presence. So what were you before this experience began? Let's consider a possibility. You were always part of the field, not a ghost waiting to enter a body, but a continuous ripple in the deeper structure of existence. According to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, all particles are connected by probabilities, entangled across space and time. These are not mechanical links. They are relationships, subtle and profound. If consciousness is embedded in the fabric of the universe, then awareness may not be produced by the brain at all. The brain may simply tune into it, like a radio receiving a signal already present. This idea challenges the materialist view that mind is a byproduct of matter. Instead, it suggests that mind is a fundamental layer of reality, like gravity or time. If that's true, then before you were born, you didn't come from nowhere, you came from everything. Your individuality may be recent, but your being is ancient. Let's pause and explore a different model. Panpsychism. This is the idea that consciousness, or at least a basic form of it, is a property of all matter. Not human-level awareness, but a kind of proto-consciousness. A flicker of experience embedded in every interaction. If this is true, then the atoms that now form your brain were already part of a field of experience before they assembled into you. They didn't become conscious. They became organized enough to express higher forms of consciousness. This view paints a poetic and scientific picture. You were once stardust, atoms forged in the hearts of ancient stars. You moved through plants, through water, through the breath of other beings. You've been part of oceans and stones, trees and air. And each time, the configuration was different. But the field remained. You weren't absent before you were born. You were dispersed. And so the emergence of you was not a singular event, but a condensation. The field gathered into form. The dispersed threads of potential wove themselves into a unique expression. That expression now walks, speaks, wonders, and dreams. But the material, the energy, the essence, it was always here. This leads to an even deeper idea, that your current self is only one expression of something broader. Your consciousness is shaped by memory, by learning, by biology. But the source may be larger than you know. Some theories in cognitive science and philosophy of mind suggest that selfhood is a narrative construct, a useful fiction built to navigate the world. That doesn't make it false, it makes it functional. But the real you may not be the character. It may be the space in which the character appears. That space is available even when you're not thinking about yourself. It's there when you gaze out the window and forget what time it is, when you're absorbed in music, when you're watching the stars. In those moments, the story fades, but something remains. That something is the part of you that doesn't need a name. It doesn't begin when you're born, and it doesn't stop when thought does. It simply is. And now, let's widen the lens even more. Consider that the universe itself may be conscious in some way, not in the sense of having a mind, but in being aware. This is speculative, but intriguing. Theoretical physicist David Bohm proposed that reality has an implicate order, a hidden, interconnected field from which all things unfold. According to this view, everything is part of a single, dynamic whole. The separation we experience is an illusion of scale. What we call the self is a local expression of a universal process. If that's true, then what you were before you were born is not separate from what you are now. You are a fold in the fabric, a temporary crest in the wave. When the wave recedes, when thought stops, when the body dissolves, the ocean remains. You don't go somewhere else. You return to what you've always been. This model can be understood without any religious framework. It aligns with physics, biology, and systems theory. In it, nothing is truly lost. Energy is never destroyed. Information can be preserved. And the field of awareness is not created. It is revealed. Let's come back to your current life. Every moment you live is shaped by perception. But perception is not passive. It's creative. Your brain takes in raw sensory data and builds a reality out of it. It filters, edits, interprets. In doing so, it creates the illusion of a solid, stable world. But underneath that illusion is movement, change, impermanence. The same is true of the self. Your memories, your beliefs, your personality, they feel stable, but they shift. They evolve. Some aspects fade, others grow. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, and yet there is a thread, a sense of continuity. That thread is not made of memory, it is made of attention. Attention is the force that gathers experience into meaning. When you are not thinking about being alive, attention returns to its source. You become aware of being without needing to define it. This is not absence, it is depth. And it might be the same depth from which you emerged before birth. So what happens when you stop identifying with the surface, the thoughts, the emotions, the story? You fall back into awareness itself, and that awareness is not personal, it's not confined. It may be the same awareness looking out through countless eyes, not duplicated, not divided, just refracted, like light through crystals. This brings us to the ancient idea of non-duality. Found in various spiritual traditions, non-duality means not two. It suggests that the distinction between self and world, subject and object, is an illusion. There is only one reality appearing in many forms. In this view, you are not in the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself as a human for a while. That's not metaphor, it's a way of seeing, and it reframes the entire question. If you are never truly separate, then the idea of being born or not born loses its edge. You were not created, you were revealed. The mask of individuality appeared, played its role, and eventually returns to the whole. So where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? You return to this unity. You become sky instead of cloud, space instead of shape. This isn't a loss, it's a homecoming. Modern neuroscience is beginning to explore these states. In deep meditation, in certain flow experiences, in dreamless sleep, there are moments when the self disappears, but awareness remains. Brain scans show altered patterns of connectivity. The default mode network, the part responsible for self-referential thought, goes quiet. But consciousness continues. This suggests that the self is not required for experience. The I is a tool, not the source. And that changes everything. It means you don't begin when the story does. You don't vanish when the story pauses. You are not the voice in your head. You are the silence in which it echoes. This silence existed before you were born. It exists now between each thought, and it will exist long after the story ends. In that silence, there is no separation, no beginning, no ending, just being. To think of yourself as a being that came from nowhere and will return to nothing is a misunderstanding born from language. There is no nothing. There is always something, always transformation, recombination, re-expression. The matter and energy that made you did not appear from the void. It was borrowed from stars, from air, from earth. It will return to those same elements. And maybe, just maybe, the awareness behind it will return too. And if consciousness is fundamental, then perhaps it doesn't need a body to exist. Perhaps it's like a field that takes different shapes depending on what it flows through. A mind like yours is one shape. A dream is another. A sleeping animal. A drifting cloud of neurons. A dying star. All may be different expressions of the same source. The truth is, we don't know. Not yet. But what we do know is this: you are not confined to this moment, this thought, this identity. You are a process, a mystery, a movement. You came from deep time, from ancient stars, from silent fields of possibility. If there is one thing we know about the universe, it's that it never really stops. Even in what appears to be stillness, like the vacuum of space or the deep pause between two thoughts, there is structure, movement, and unfolding. The illusion of nothingness conceals an ever-active background, and perhaps that's true for the self as well. Maybe you are not a fixed object flickering into existence at birth and disappearing at death. Maybe you are like a waveform, rising into form, dipping into silence, but never actually ceasing. What were you before you were born? The question often presumes a binary. Either you were something or you were nothing. But nature doesn't usually work in absolutes. Between something and nothing lies a whole spectrum of intermediate states. Before your consciousness arose, there were precursors, biological, energetic, and possibly even informational. Let's consider the principle of continuity. In physics, especially in thermodynamics and quantum field theory, continuity is essential. Matter and energy don't simply appear from nowhere. They transform. A flame doesn't come from emptiness. It is the release of potential energy stored in a chemical bond. Similarly, the mind doesn't come from a vacuum. It arises as part of a larger, structured process. If we apply this thinking to consciousness, we start to see that your mind, your awareness, may not be the first spark of your existence. You might be a point on a continuum, a node in a vast network. What came before you is not separate from you. It shaped you, and what you are now is part of what will follow. This perspective becomes even more interesting when we look at theories of consciousness that don't rely solely on the brain. For instance, integrated information theory, IIT, suggests that consciousness arises wherever there is a high degree of integrated information. That means wherever a system is both differentiated and unified, like the human brain, consciousness can emerge. But the theory doesn't limit this emergence to humans. In principle, any system with a certain threshold of complexity and integration could have some level of awareness. This implies that consciousness might be a universal feature of complex systems. Not all forms of consciousness are alike, of course. There's a vast difference between human self-awareness and the minimal sentience of a simple organism. But the important idea is that experience is not exclusive to one moment, one form, or one life. It is something the universe appears to generate under the right conditions. And if those conditions can arise more than once, then so can experience. This opens the possibility that your awareness is not limited to this specific configuration of mind and body. Before you were born, your atoms were elsewhere. Your molecules had different forms. They were part of stars, planets, oceans, and trees. But were you aware in those forms? Maybe not in the way you are now, but perhaps some thread of being, some quality of experience was still present. This is not to suggest you were a conscious tree or an aware ocean, but it might mean that what you call you is just the latest pattern in a series of evolving informational and physical structures. Your birth didn't generate you from nothing. It may have just brought the conditions into alignment for this particular version of you to arise. Let's take it further. What about when you're not thinking about being alive? Where do you go in those moments? Perhaps the better question is, why do you assume you go anywhere at all? When your conscious thought quiets, when you're meditating, sleeping, or daydreaming, you often report a feeling of timelessness or a sense of unity with everything around you. These are not states of absence, they're states of altered presence. The idea that we are only ourselves when we are narrating our experience is a narrow view. Neuroscience shows that large parts of your brain are active even when you're not consciously thinking. Your sense of self, the inner monologue you often associate with being you, is just one process among many. It's not the control center, it's the commentary. When the commentary goes silent, the processes continue. The body breathes, the heart beats, the brain sorts memories, consolidates information, and regulates systems. Conscious awareness doesn't disappear. It shifts. It unhooks from language and becomes something quieter, deeper, and harder to pin down. This is why states like lucid dreaming, deep meditation, and psychedelic experience are so fascinating to science. They reveal that consciousness is not a binary switch, it's a spectrum. In some states, your awareness is sharply focused on external stimuli. In others, it's turned inward, abstracted, or completely unanchored from time. When you're not thinking about being alive, you don't become less real. You may actually be closer to your fundamental state. The mental chatter, the constant reaffirmation of I am, is like a mask. When it drops, the underlying presence remains. You're not lost, you're simply unobserved. This also changes how we think about death. If your awareness can persist in the absence of egoic thought, then perhaps it is not entirely tied to the brain's narrative machinery. Perhaps what dies is not the self, but the story. And what remains is something quieter, beyond description. From a scientific standpoint, we don't yet know what happens to consciousness after death. Some researchers argue that it simply ceases, like a candle going out. Others believe we lack the tools to measure what actually occurs. But what we can observe is that during near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness are reported with striking consistency. These experiences are not just dreams or hallucinations. They often feel more real than waking life. They are filled with clarity, connection, and a sense of timeless presence. Could it be that what we perceive as the end is actually a transition to another state of awareness? One unbound from the strictures of time, body, and narrative. It's possible. Not provable, but not dismissible either. Let's pivot now and consider memory. Memory is usually thought of as the record of the past, but new research suggests that memory is also about predicting the future. The brain doesn't store events like files in a cabinet. It stores patterns, networks of associations that help us anticipate outcomes. In this way, memory is not a mirror of what was, it's a map of what could be. So if your mind is a pattern recognition engine, then you are the sum of your remembered and anticipated experiences. You exist as a kind of temporal bridge, anchored in the present, but shaped by what came before and what might come next. When you're not actively thinking, those patterns don't vanish. They rest. They continue to shape perception in the background. This is why we often find insight in moments of stillness. A problem you couldn't solve in the midst of effort resolves itself during a walk, or a dream, or a long pause. Your awareness never really stops working. It just works in different ways. The quiet mind is not a blank mind, it is a receptive one. And what about the time before your memory began? Your early childhood is largely a blank slate, at least in terms of narrative recall. But that doesn't mean you weren't experiencing the world. You were just doing so without the language to describe it. Infants experience rich sensory input, emotional waves, and relational bonds. They just don't store it in the format we later call memory. This implies that before your identity formed, before you had a name, a belief system, or a story, you were still conscious, aware, responsive. And if you were conscious then, without words or concepts, then perhaps consciousness does not depend on those things. Perhaps it's more basic than we assume. This brings us to the notion of pre-conscious existence. Before birth, your nervous system was developing, processing, and reacting. Studies show that fetuses can respond to sound, light, and even rhythmic stimuli. We don't know what this experience is like, but it is experience of some kind. Some researchers propose that awareness exists on a continuum that begins even before self-awareness does. In this model, consciousness is layered. Each new developmental stage adds new capabilities, memory, language, reflection, but the foundational layer never disappears. It only becomes more complex. So again, what were you before you were born? You were already participating in experience. Not thinking perhaps, but being. Not observing, but responding. Not naming, but sensing. And when you're not thinking now, when the story pauses, you may be returning to that same foundational layer. The part of you that simply is. That doesn't analyze, compare, or explain. That doesn't divide the world into categories. That simply watches, listens, breathes. From this perspective, life is not something that starts and stops. It is something that flows into form, into thought, into silence, and back again. What we call birth and death may just be transitions in that flow. Changes in shape, but not endings, not in the absolute sense. The universe is full of such transitions. Stars collapse into black holes, which may seed new galaxies. Trees fall and become the soil for new growth. Matter cycles endlessly, and if consciousness is a part of this same universe, subject to its laws and patterns, then why would it be an exception? You are not a spark flaring up from darkness. You are a loop in a much larger pattern, a temporary expression of something much more continuous. You emerge, dissolve, emerge again, not as the same self, but as a continuation of being. Consciousness often seems like the most familiar thing in the world. After all, it's what you use to experience everything else. And yet, the more deeply you examine it, the more mysterious it becomes. You might assume that being conscious means having a sense of self, a stream of thoughts, an ability to look out at the world and name what you see. But if that were all consciousness was, it would vanish every time you stopped thinking, every time you forgot your name or drifted off to sleep. And it doesn't. Not entirely. In fact, what remains when those things fall away may be closer to what consciousness truly is. Let's start with perception. Long before you formed an identity or began to narrate your life, you were already seeing light, hearing sounds, and feeling temperature on your skin. These sensations were not structured into memories or attached to meaning the way they are now, but they were still part of your lived experience. They were the foundation of awareness before the concept of I took hold. This pre-conceptual awareness is something you can still access. In fact, it may be the default mode when your mind becomes quiet, when the internal dialogue pauses and the labels fall away. What remains isn't a blank space. It's a presence, a field of experience that is still alive and responsive. And it may be this field, more than your memories or beliefs or name, that is the essence of what you are. Interestingly, some theories in modern neuroscience suggest that the self is not a single unified thing, but a constantly updated model, a kind of useful hallucination. Your brain creates a model of the world, including a model of you in that world, to help predict outcomes and reduce uncertainty. But that model isn't fixed. It changes depending on context, attention, and brain activity. In altered states of consciousness, through meditation, psychedelics, or brain injury, that model can temporarily dissolve, and yet, even without the usual sense of self, awareness often continues. This challenges the idea that the self is required for consciousness. It suggests that you can be without being you, that awareness does not vanish when identity does. Instead, it may expand, shift, or become unfiltered by narrative. And if awareness can persist beyond the self, it raises a profound question. Did it exist before the self ever formed? If you consider yourself not as a permanent, isolated identity, but as a temporary configuration of awareness, then birth becomes not a beginning, but a threshold, a transition point where the conditions for this particular form of experience became aligned. Before that threshold, the components of you were already present, physically in the atoms of stars and oceans, biologically in the DNA passed down through generations, and possibly experientially in subtler ways we don't yet understand. Could awareness exist independently of form? It's a radical idea, but not without precedent. In several branches of philosophy and spirituality, awareness is treated as the fundamental layer of reality, not something that emerges from matter, but something from which matter emerges. In these frameworks, consciousness isn't produced by the brain like light from a bulb. It's more like the screen on which the entire show of life is projected. This doesn't mean your current experience is an illusion. It means it's a particular configuration of something more foundational. The thoughts, sensations, emotions, and memories you experience are real in context, but they arise within a deeper field of being. A field that may have existed before you were born and may continue in some form after. Of course, science is cautious about such claims. Consciousness remains one of the hardest problems in science, not just because it's difficult to study, but because it may require a rethinking of what science is. Most of science deals with objective phenomena, things that can be measured, repeated, and verified. Consciousness, however, is inherently subjective. It is not something you can observe from the outside. You can only be it. This makes the study of consciousness a unique frontier, one that blends neuroscience, physics, psychology, philosophy, and even contemplative traditions. And while no definitive answers have emerged, the questions themselves are reshaping how we think about reality. If the universe is fundamentally conscious, or if consciousness is woven into the fabric of the cosmos, then your existence is not a cosmic accident. It is a particular unfolding of something much more vast. This perspective leads us to reconsider where you go when you're not actively aware of being alive. Consider deep sleep. During certain phases of sleep, brain activity quiets to an extraordinary degree. The self disappears. Memories aren't active. Sensory input is minimal. And yet, when you wake, you report that time has passed. Sometimes you say you slept deeply, but who or what made that report? What part of you is still present to register the absence of content? You might say the body remembers. That's true, but perhaps something else does too. Some part of you, not as a narrative self, but as raw awareness, may remain present even in the absence of thought. This has been echoed in reports from deep meditation, where practitioners describe a state of pure presence. No thoughts, no time, no self, but a vivid sense of being. This is not sleep. It is not unconsciousness in the traditional sense. It is a different form of consciousness, one that does not rely on identity, language, or story. And it suggests that when you are not thinking about being alive, you do not cease. You return to something deeper, something that might resemble the state you came from before you were born. Some cultures and philosophies describe this as the ground of being, a state from which all things arise and to which they return. It is not a place, but a condition. Not a location, but a field. And it may be that every time your thoughts go quiet, you brush against this ground, this underlying sea of awareness that always was and always will be. This doesn't mean you're immortal in the traditional sense, but it does suggest that what you truly are may not be confined to the boundaries of your birth and death. You are more than your memories, more than your identity. You are a process of unfolding awareness, a momentary lens through which the universe looks at itself. And if that's true, then even the moments when you feel most absent, most empty or disconnected are not evidence of non-existence. They are invitations to look deeper, to notice what remains when the noise subsides. That subtle presence may not shout, it may not narrate, but it is steady, it is vast, it is always there, beneath the surface of your thoughts, waiting to be noticed. Where do you go when you're not thinking about being alive? You go nowhere. You remain exactly where you've always been, in the field of awareness itself. Only the surface changes, the content shifts, but the field remains. And before you were born, perhaps that field was already there, timeless, silent, and waiting for the right conditions to become you. This way of thinking doesn't require you to reject science or logic. It invites you to look beyond the assumptions we often take for granted, that the self is fixed, that awareness is the byproduct of matter, that birth marks a beginning and death marks an end. Instead, you can consider the possibility that awareness is not produced by the body, but filtered through it. That what you call I is a channel, not a source. This doesn't make your individual experience any less meaningful. In fact, it might make it more precious. To be this particular configuration of awareness for this brief moment in cosmic time is extraordinary. It means the universe has taken the shape of you, not by accident, but as part of its own unfolding complexity. And that unfolding includes the forgetting, the silence, the spaces between thoughts. You are not just what you think. You are also what you don't think. And if awareness is a fundamental aspect of reality, then you never really came from nowhere. You came from the same place stars came from, the same field that gave rise to space, time, gravity, and galaxies may have also given rise to you. Before you were born, you were not absent. You were potential. You were structure waiting to cohere. And when your mind quiets, when you stop thinking, you return to that same field, not as a regression, but as a kind of homecoming. This is not something to fear, it's something to explore, not with conclusions, but with curiosity. Because perhaps the point isn't to solve the mystery of what you were before you were born, but to live in a way that keeps the question alive, to wonder, to listen, to notice the subtle presence that exists even in silence. And maybe, just maybe, to realize that you've never really been separate from the mystery at all. Throughout history, people have searched for the boundaries of consciousness, the edges where awareness ends and the self begins. But every attempt to define those edges seems to reveal that they are not fixed lines at all, but more like shifting tides. The closer we examine the concept of selfhood, the more it dissolves under scrutiny, and what remains might not be a thing at all, but a field of possibility, an open space where experience arises, unfolds, and fades without a solid center. In neuroscience, one way to explore the self is through brain imaging during various states of consciousness. When subjects undergo deep meditation, or when they're under the influence of psychedelics, or in states of extreme focus, something interesting happens. Activity in the brain's default mode network, the part associated with self-referential thinking, decreases significantly. This network is usually active when you're thinking about your past, your future, or yourself in general. But when it goes quiet, the ordinary sense of I also tends to fade. Despite that, experience continues. People report a loss of ego, but not a loss of being. In fact, many describe it as a heightened state of presence. This tells us something essential, that your identity is not the same as your awareness. The former is constructed, the latter perhaps is not. So what does this mean for the question, what were you before you were born? Maybe the better question is, what is it that forms the basis of your awareness in the first place? If it doesn't begin with thought, with language, or even with memory, then perhaps it precedes those things entirely. In the earliest moments after birth, your sense of the world was raw and unfiltered. You didn't know what you were looking at or why. There were no names, no stories. There was only sensation. And in that state, you weren't yet a defined self, but awareness was still present. This is not a philosophical stretch. It's a developmental fact. Before your autobiographical memory emerged, before your brain stitched together a coherent self-image, you were already experiencing the world. Now reverse that even further. Before birth, your brain was developing. Electrical signals were already firing. There was activity, response to stimuli, early formation of sensory processing. Could there have been moments of pure awareness without a self to interpret it? If so, those moments didn't belong to you in the way you think of yourself now, but they still happened. And if awareness doesn't require identity, then maybe it was always part of the system, only waiting for complexity to shape it into something personal. There's a concept in biology known as emergence. It refers to how complex systems arise from simple interactions. A single neuron can't think, but billions of them working together in a structured network give rise to thought. Likewise, a single water molecule can't make a wave, but put trillions together and you can have the ocean. Consciousness might be an emergent property of organized information, but that doesn't mean it's reducible to its parts. Once a system crosses a certain threshold of complexity, entirely new behaviors emerge, behaviors that cannot be predicted by examining the components alone. So when your brain formed its first conscious states, perhaps it wasn't the birth of something entirely new, but a new pattern of something that already existed in a diffuse, potential form. Before your birth, the atoms that make you were part of stars, clouds, and planets. Before you had thoughts, the universe was already active, flowing, creating. Your birth didn't invent awareness. It might have localized it, turned it inward, wrapped it in memory and personality. And what about those moments when you're not thinking about being alive? What happens when your thoughts vanish during a walk, or when you're lost in music, or staring at a sky so vast it quiets your mind completely? In those moments, you don't disappear. You stop narrating, but the experience goes on. You're not unconscious, you're just not filtering reality through your personal story. Some traditions call this pure consciousness, a form of awareness that exists without attachment to identity, without judgment or mental noise. Science doesn't yet have a term for this, though it's beginning to study the brain patterns associated with it. But many people have felt it, a spaciousness that isn't empty, a silence that doesn't feel like absence, but presence, a kind of being that doesn't require doing or naming. When you stop thinking about being alive, you don't go away. You return to the field where experience arises. You rest in a state of presence that's deeper than the surface-level content of the mind. This field may not be unique to you. It may be part of a shared structure, something universal, like the fabric of space itself. Some physicists have proposed that space is not empty. It's filled with quantum fluctuations, a constant seething of potential. Even nothing is not truly nothing. It contains fields and probabilities, patterns waiting to unfold. If the very vacuum of space contains information and possibility, why wouldn't the same be true for the state of awareness before your birth? Perhaps you were not absent. You were part of that potential, information waiting to coalesce, structure waiting to form. This connects to the idea of panpsychism, the philosophical notion that consciousness is a fundamental property of all matter. Not that a rock is self-aware, but that even the simplest particles carry a glimmer of awareness, just as they carry mass and charge. If that's true, then what you call you is simply one complex manifestation of a property that exists everywhere. Before you were born, Ishan, you existed in a different form, not as a person, but as a possibility within the universe's unfolding pattern. And after that moment of birth, that possibility took shape. Your senses activated, your brain synchronized. You began to build a model of the world and a model of yourself within it. But the awareness underneath, the core ability to experience, may have been there all along, simply waiting for the right structure to give it shape. This also raises fascinating possibilities about memory and identity. If you can experience moments of deep presence without remembering who you are, then identity is clearly not required for experience. But it also means that the continuity of you is fragile. Your sense of self is constantly reconstructed, on waking, during trauma, through illness or transformation. And yet, despite this, something continuous seems to persist. That continuity may not be your story. It may be the field of awareness itself. The same field you tap into when you stop thinking. The same field that may have existed before you had a name, a past, or a future. You are not the voice in your head. You are the space in which that voice speaks. And that space is present even when the voice goes silent. Where you go when you stop thinking may not be a place at all. It may be a shift in perspective, a return to a broader kind of presence, one that holds experience without controlling it. You are still here, you are still alive, but you are not bound by the self you normally inhabit. Before you were born, maybe that's where you were too, not in a void, but in a field of unstructured presence. Not a memory, not a mind, but the conditions that allow both to exist. This idea doesn't require belief. You can test it in experience. Sit in silence. Watch your thoughts come and go. Notice what remains when they vanish. That presence, silent, aware, without labels, is closer to what you were before you were born than any story could ever be. And maybe that's what you return to in those empty spaces between thoughts, in deep meditation or in sleep. A state that is not defined by time or form. A state that is not elsewhere, but right here, beneath everything. Hello everyone. As we begin to draw this exploration to a close, let us reflect gently on the vastness of what we have considered. The mystery of what you were before you were born, and where you go when you're not thinking about being alive, invites you into a profound space of wonder. It reminds us that consciousness is not confined to the surface stories we tell ourselves, but is a deeper, more expansive presence that both precedes and outlasts those stories. As you prepare to rest tonight, allow yourself to gently let go of all the labels, the narratives, and the thoughts that have woven your identity through the day. Notice the quiet space beneath your mind's chatter, the stillness that has been there all along. This quiet presence is your true foundation. It is vast, timeless, and welcoming. Science and philosophy suggest that consciousness may be fundamental to the universe itself, that the awareness within you is connected to everything around you and everything that has ever been. Before birth, you were part of this greater whole, not separate, not alone, and when thought fades, when the mind goes quiet, you return to it again. Not to a place of emptiness, but to a home of infinite possibility and calm. As you settle into your body and your breath slows, feel yourself becoming that presence, the presence that watches the flow of experience without needing to hold on. Let yourself drift softly into the space where awareness and stillness meet. Know that in this space you are whole and safe. You need nothing but the gentle rhythm of your breath and the quiet unfolding of the night. Tonight, as you fall asleep, remember that your essence, this unbounded awareness, continues even as your conscious mind rests. You do not disappear. You simply enter a different phase of being, one where the stories pause and the presence remains. So rest now, let go, sink into the soft embrace of stillness, and know that you are part of a vast, timeless flow. Your journey continues beyond the boundaries of birth and thought, carried by the endless river of consciousness itself. Good night, and may your sleep be deep, peaceful, and restorative. Until we meet again here in Sleep Space, know that you are forever connected to the mystery and the wonder of being.